Welcome, Sunderland fans, to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. I'm your host for today, James Copley, and I'm joined by my colleague Phil Smith. Phil, how are you? How's the arm?
Yeah, it's still sore and it's still very much broken and still very much wrapped up, but we're still going.
And yet, still at work. Absolute dedication to the fullest from Phil. We'll get started, obviously, with transfers as usual. Main story at the moment regarding a certain Danny Bart. That one's come out sort of the blue, I guess. Blackburn Rovers may be holding an interest, and there's been some reports suggesting that Sunderland wouldn't stand in his way. Phil, what do you make of it all? Obviously, Sunderland have signed a couple of centre-backs this season.
Yeah, sort of a one of those stories that is sort of kind of really surprising, but then also actually after you've sort of sat with it for 5 minutes, it sort of isn't quite as surprising as you first think. And obviously, I think the first thing to say, obviously, just chatting about it, is that there's absolutely no way I'd be looking to lose Danny Bart this summer. I mean, he was outstanding last year. He was not just for the sort of intangible stuff. Everyone speaks so highly in terms of his leadership and the way he is around the place. Certainly, I think any journalist who's had any sort of dialogue with him will tell you, what a obviously sort of mature and experienced player he is. And obviously his contribution on the pitch was massive as well, first and foremost. Beyond that, there was a lot of defensive injuries, but he was in that team on merit. And he was outstanding. So it would seem kind of crazy for Sunderland to be looking to move him on. I strongly suspect they aren't actively looking to move him on. But something we've obviously talked a lot about on the pod, James, is that, it's a big part of Sunderland's sort of strategy, if you like, that they'll always say to players when they come to the club that they won't stand in their way if they do fall down the pecking order. And so with Sunderland recruiting, another 2 or 3 centre-halves this summer, with Luke O'Nien, I think, very much seen as a centre-half now. I don't think there's any sort of where does he play anymore. I think Mowbray likes him at centre-half, possibly at full-back if needs must. But I don't see Luke being a midfielder anymore. The point I'm trying to make is, and Mowbray actually alluded to this a few months ago, there's going to be a lot of competition. And so if there was interest in Danny, a chance potentially for a longer contract, and potentially a chance to play week in, week out, then I think it's a conversation that, the club and the player would have. But I have to say at this stage, it doesn't seem right to me that someone would be letting Bart go at this stage when, some of you centre-halves have still got a few injury concerns. Some of them have never played at championship level. It doesn't quite sit right with me at the moment. Mm-hmm. But I think you can understand kind of the process, if you like, as to where this has potentially come from. I think the example I would most use is probably the Tom Flanagan one, where when Tom Flanagan went on deadline day, there was a lot of surprise and a lot of concern, and kind of rightly so, because Sunderland were left a bit short at centre-half for the rest of that season, weren't they? But Sunderland were pretty clear that, look, you've got to treat players in the right way. Flanagan had the option of a longer contract to get some real stability and certainty for his family. And so Sunderland let him take that option. I think that's what they want to try and do for all players within reason. So I guess what I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way as usual is that I can kind of see a way in which Bart would potentially move on this summer, but it doesn't sit right or make total sense to me at the moment that both parties would be actively looking like that at the moment. Because for me, there's still every chance Bart's in the team on the first day of the season. There's still a massive chance Bart's in the team on this first day of the season.
Let's just attack that for a second, because you've got Dan Ballard, who's had a few injury issues himself. Hopefully he's back up to speed for the start of the season, but we don't know. Obviously, transfer interest in him from West Ham. And then you've got Danny Bart, who was the starting centre-back alongside him for 38 games in the Championship. Triantis has come in the summer. He's unproven and picked up a knock on Australia international duty. He hasn't actually returned to the Academy of Light yet, or arrived at the Academy of Light yet, so we're not sure. Aji Alisi, we know he's had a setback. Joe Anderson hasn't played much. He could go out on loan. Jensen Sealt, he's had an injury as well. So then you're looking at Luke O'Nien. When you frame it in that context, as you rightly say, Phil, you start looking at who's going to be in that 11 in the opening game of the season against Ipswich Town. And if he's fit, you'd assume you'd assume Bath would definitely be in there.
Exactly. Maybe, maybe towards the very back end of August, So maybe Jensen Seelt plays in the Carabao Cup game and we go, oh my God, this guy's never going to miss a game again. He's unbelievable, you know. Or maybe we get to January and, you know, Jensen Seelt and Triantis are fixtures in the team and Bart isn't playing much and he's got 6 months left on his deal and someone wants to come in and offer him a 2-year deal or whatever, you know, you can see, I suppose that's what I've been trying to say here. I can see the situation in which it happens, but right now at this stage of the summer, I just don't think you're in a position where you could just let Danny Batth go. That aspect of it doesn't make sense to me. And I think also you've got to think, you know, for all, I think Sunderland are very proactive, and I think it's right. Really, you've got to treat players right, especially proper people who serve the club well. You know, when you talk about players like Danny Batth, Bailey Wright being a classic example, you've got to do right by them. But you have also got to put the club first. Of course, you do. It's, you know, it's football. It's professional sport. And I just think at the moment, you know, while I think we could definitely see some outgoings, I think you've got to be pretty careful because it's got to be structured, and you've got to make sure that you don't leave the squad light. Because while we're talking about a squad that's in a pretty good place, I think generally, and obviously a fantastic effort to get 4 new signings in before pre-season even begun. You know, you are in a situation, especially because of the injuries, where, you know, you are 1 or 2. If you lose 1 or 2, you're potentially looking a little bit light. You know, and Ipswich Town are going to be a good side this year. So definitely one to watch, I think, over the coming period. I don't think it's come from sort of nowhere, if you like. And I think it's pretty obvious from the Blackburn end that they want an experienced defender because they've obviously lost Daniel Ayala this summer. So I think it's pretty clear that, there is definitely something in this. But for me, like, first and foremost, you know, we obviously do get attached to players, and when someone has as good a season as he does, and offers something different as well. I think that's the thing about Danny Batth, isn't it? Then I think that, you know, it doesn't quite make sense to me at this moment. But obviously, we'll have to wait and see how it develops. But until you've seen the new lads fit, firing, and looking comfortable, I think that's a little bit of a gamble too far.
Yeah, I think it would be a very bold and brave call if he was to go this summer, although I agree with the majority of what the recruitment team have done at the Stadium of Light. I just feel that losing a player of Danny Batth's experience and calibre would be hard for the squad to absorb initially. I'm not saying Triantis and Seelt won't get there, but, you know, it does take a while to adapt to English football. When you were saying there, Phil, that Seelt might come in the Carabao Cup against Crewe Alexander, I was thinking of Aji Alisi. I think made his debut against Sheffield Wednesday in the Carabao Cup and didn't look brilliant, really, but one of his first senior appearances in football. Might have been his first, actually. We've seen the way he's progressed over the sort of 12 months he's been at Sunderland. So there is that argument to make as well. On the flip side, as we've mentioned, performances have been brilliant. I think there's a serious argument to be made, Phil. You may disagree that pound for pound, since his arrival in that January before Lee Johnson was sacked, you could argue that Danny Batth's been one of Sunderland's best signings.
Yeah, 100%. Really, I think I would go as far as say a sensational signing, really. I mean, it took him a little while. He had an incredible debut against Portsmouth and then struggled for a while. Struggled for a while after that. But I mean, towards the end of the season, I mean, really,
top draw,
really excellent. And then what he did last year was, you know, to think that, I know there was loads of different factors to it, finances and what have you, but to think that Stoke sort of, you know, let him go to a League One club, you know, for him to come back to that level 6 months later and then produce the level of performance he did over the course of the season, was nothing short of excellent. I mean, and I think, you know, you will not find a Sunderland fan with a bad word to say about Danny Batth. No nonsense, hugely effective. Clearly a very, very down-to-earth, sort of humble footballer in person. He's been exceptional, and you do have to be very careful when you let those players go, as you say.
Well, progress for progress' sake sometimes isn't the best thing, is it?
But I think that obviously, you know, there's a lot of different aspects to it as well. And you think about the development of the side. You know, we know the style of football Sunderland want to play, and over time that is going to demand playing a pretty high line, I think. And you're going to want a certain level of pace, I think, as well in your defence. And we saw that with Bailey Wright, to be honest, to an extent last year as well. And so you it's not hard to see what the direction of travel is when you're seeing these younger defenders come in, most of whom have grown up in academies where there's a huge amount of emphasis on playing out from the back as well, and that's such a huge part of their armoury. So I think you can see where the general direction of travel here is. But if the conversation's, does Danny Batth still have something to contribute to Sunderland? Then yeah, a hell of a lot. And sometimes, you have to walk before you can run, and I think you can't put a price on. And I would put him in. Actually, I would put Bart in a very, very similar category to Alex Pritchard, who I thought was genuinely exceptional last season. Not always in the most sort of explosive, obvious way, but particularly the first stages of the season when Sunderland were adapting to a new level. His experience, his sort of poise on the ball, the way he presses, he was such an underrated part of why Sunderland were able to acclimatise pretty quickly. Yeah, and I thought maybe in a slightly more of an impact way at the end of the year, I thought he was excellent. I still think back to that Preston game where, again, he may not have been the obvious player on the pitch, in terms of some of the things that were happening with Ahmad's 30-yard or whatever. And I know Pritchard scored a lovely goal, so maybe that's not the best example, but the amount of times he came on and just knitted the play together. Pritchard and Bart are the kind of players who, Corey Evans as well, I suppose, who make other players look better. They make other players look better because of the work they do. And I think that you sort of, you tinker with that. That's a big gamble. The obvious caveat being you don't know who could potentially come in to replace him. Sunderland's record on that front over the last 18 months has been very, very strong. Danny Batth being an obvious example of that. So I think there's a huge amount of factors at play. For me, it just doesn't work for me right now. I just don't see it. Do I see the situation changing over the next 6 to 12 months? Possibly. But I can't quite make my peace with that at the moment. And it would be a surprise to me if it happened at any point in the relative near future.
Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't want to see Danny Batth leave the club. Interesting what you say about Pritchard there as well, Phil, because I guess the other side to it, away from the playing part, is off the field as well. And just thinking of Pritchard there, I think it was after the Coventry game, first game of the season in the Championship. Sunderland did well for large parts of that match, and then Coventry really had a strong last 30 minutes, and Sunderland were hanging on a little bit. And Pritchard came out, and if you remember his interview with Sky, he almost set the standard for the whole season, didn't he? He said, this has to be a little bit of a wake-up call. I think it was the Coventry game. And it was quite an honest and brash interview, and he said that Sunderland needed to get up to the standard, and I think you need that sort of leadership in the squad with your like of, Lyndon Gooch is another one, Pritchard, Batth, and you do have to be careful in terms of the character of the squad as well. There are so many benefits to having young players around the place. You get that sort of fearless talent that Ahmad had, the willingness to try things like Jack Clarke has, the physical attributes of Ekwah, the energy of the team, the pressing, but you do need some experienced heads in there as well.
Yeah, and over time things slightly shift, because in a year's time we'll actually be speaking about Dan Neil as a pretty experienced footballer. Even though he'll still only be 22, but by that point he could theoretically be knocking on the door of 150 games in a senior football. That's quite a lot of experience, really. So it's not so much about age, I don't think. And maybe all of us get sucked into that aspect of the discussion a little bit. It's not as simple as age equals experience and youth equals naivety. Sometimes that's not really the case. But I think the level of football that someone like Pritchard has played at for such a long time, the understanding of what it takes, not just to be a good footballer, but a successful one over a long period of time, the professionalism, being around teams that have been promoted. And to be fair, let's give Sunderland some credit as well. They know that, and that's the reason why these players were recruited. It's not that Sunderland, we've said it before, it's not that Sunderland won't sign players at the upper end of their age bracket. It's just that they won't pay huge fees for them. There's a huge difference between the two, and there's still 2 months of the summer window left. Who's to say that they won't bring in a holding midfielder, what have you, of an older age gap, maybe on loan or a free transfer or whatever. I think Sunderland, Speakman, when he first arrived at the club, talked about ensuring that, yes, we want a young athletic squad playing a very aggressive brand of football, but we'll also ensure that we have the right levels of ages in the group so we have that experience. So What might change over time is, like I say, some of these younger players might reach the point where they're actually quite experienced, and it possibly changes your perception as well. Maybe we don't need that inverted commas experienced head, because actually Dan Ballard's played 200 championship games, Anthony Patterson's played 200 senior games, and at that point, they have a good, especially at the club size of Sunderland, they'll have seen a lot of ups and downs in that time. So I think the situation will change over time. But for me, I think it was an amazing season that went well beyond all of our expectations. I wouldn't want to be changing that platform that you have from that group too much at this stage. And like I say, back end of the window, I'm probably more thinking January though, if the situation has changed significantly. It's a totally different conversation, isn't it? But but the thing I would keep going back to is that something, like I say, are very sort of proactive and very strong in saying we want to do right by our players, and that's a huge part of the discussion. We're speculating now on where everybody's heads, but it will be relative to what else could potentially be out there. What kind of security does that offer? What kind of role does that offer? And those will be factors as well. But I think it's going to be a really interesting end to the window, isn't it? Because this is the first time that we've really been grappling with outgoings in a significant way in this regime. Because there obviously was that first summer where the retain list was pretty severe and a lot of established players left. And obviously there was a lot of discussion around that. That was very much the sort of start of the new era, if you like. But actually, there's never really been significant chat about player exits for one reason or another. As we discussed, I think, on last week's pod, getting promoted last year stopped really a lot of those conversations that would have happened having happened. Probably with players like Ross Stewart, maybe Dan Neil even. Yeah, it did. Yeah, and that was good. And that was why that pause happened, where it was, we need to get out of this league, because not getting out of the league would have made implementing everything they wanted to do in the longer term so much more difficult. And that was a classic example of that, because you would have had bids coming in and players saying, well, I probably want to test myself at a high level. So, it's going to be really interesting into the window, particularly because there's such a strong start on incomings, sort of leaves you with a vague idea of where the squad's at and what it's going to look like. And obviously now we're in this phase where Speakman spoke about, we'll probably have a little pause, not as in we're not going to try and sign anyone, but while we work out what we've got in the building and while other clubs work out what they've got in the building. Don't forget that either. These Premier League clubs will be going on their tours of the US and they'll be taking 35 players with them. And they won't want to let players go until they've got back from that and they know what they're doing. So because there's been probably a slight lull in terms of the incomings, we're in this interesting period now where a lot of the focus is on maybe other players clubs trying to take away from Sunderland. And how that's managed, it's going to be really, really interesting.
I guess that's the benefit of getting those 4 signings done relatively early, Phil, is that you can see how the market develops, and crucially, which Sunderland have done so many times over the years, almost as many windows as I've seen in my lifetime. How often have we seen Sunderland scrambling around at the end of a transfer window in sort of desperation, need of positions filling? And you look at the squad now, obviously, possibly some outgoings expected, but if that squad was to go into the championship season, you would want a couple more. You always want a couple more, but you would be relatively comfortable with that now, I think. And I think that's due to the early business done.
I think the best clubs get players in the building before they sell. I think that's what. Obviously, it's not always as neat as that. Sometimes that's just not going to happen. But generally speaking, teams get players in the building because it's the most obvious thing in the book, isn't it? If you sell your star winger for 25 million and then you go and try and buy another young winger, the price is going to be pretty high, because someone's going to say, well, you've got 25 million quid burning in your pocket. And that's what, Brentford, Brighton, they've done so well. They've developed from within, so that actually when they cash that money, the successor is quite often already in the building, and that totally changes the profile of what they have to do, and it leaves them in such a strong position. And I think we're trying to see Sunderland do that, and I think they've done it pretty well by and large so far, albeit it's probably a bit early days in some positions, but which is partially why we talked so much about the Ross Stewart situation, because we were still worried really, I guess, to an extent, that Sunderland weren't in that position whereby they could say if the big bid came in, well, that's okay, Stewart can go. We've got these 2 players who've been sort of developing into that role. So I think that's where I think you look at the business that's been done so far and you sort of nod your head, because it's a lot easier to have these conversations about Danny Batth. Well, you can see that there are 2 new centre halves in the building, and Joe Anderson from January went as well over time. And although we're not talking so much about these positions in terms of potential outgoings, you have players like Pierre Ekwa, who was brought in and integrated slowly, and is now ready after 6 months. You just think, I mean, Ekwa's going to start against Ipswich, right? Unless something goes awry in the next few weeks. I don't think it will.
Him and Dan Neely would expect, wouldn't you?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the ticks when you look at what Sunderland are doing. I think that gives you a huge amount of encouragement, and it does leave them in a stronger position generally. But it's interesting when we come to, as I'm sure, well, I assume we were planning to go to Jack Clarke.
Yes, we are.
Because Jack Clarke is a really interesting one in that context, that you've already lost at Mad, who I think was 14 goals across all competitions last season.
Probably 5-6 assists as well. Yeah,
few assists as well. Yeah. If you then take Clarke out of that,
that's 24.
Yeah. 24. Wow, that's a lot of goals and assists to take out the team. Now, theoretically, their successes, as we've just been talking about, are in the building. But Jefferson Bennett's been out for a while with a shoulder injury, didn't get a huge amount of opportunity last year. Isaac Lahadji we've barely seen anything of, because Robertson and Ahmad were just too good at the end of last year, and there was a playoff charge on, and how on earth can you drop either of those two? So yeah, that's, again, it's a weird one, because I feel like we can just talk ourselves into don't ever sell a player ever, and that's just not realistic. But the Clarke one is interesting for me, because right now, I think if you take his goals and assists out of the team with Ahmad as well, I think that changes the team too much in one window.
I completely agree. And then if you looked further back, and then Bart goes as well, that's quite, that's quite a few of your core players, really. I'm not saying Bart will definitely go, but you get me point that I'm agreeing with you essentially that if you start tinkering too much, then you do need a degree of stability at a football club, especially when the stated aim now is to push on again.
Yeah, and I think that's a relevant point to what we're talking about as well. Sunderland, there's been a bit of a shift in terms of correcting, every opportunity he's had of late. Christian Speakman talking about, look, the model is to build a team to get promoted. It just may be that along the way it makes sense, and we will, players will leave. So I think that's probably as well, we should probably sort of stress that as well when we're having these discussions. It's not like an auction at Sunderland by any stretch of the imagination. And at the moment, to be honest, the fees that are being bandied around for Clarke, I just think
derisory. In my opinion.
I just think why. I think it's absolutely derisory. And again, like kind of alluding to it, obviously I was talking slightly tongue in cheek before, but there's an element to it. We are biased, and we are all going to think the Sunderland players are worth 60 million. And if you want to sign them, you're going to have to spend. And but that's because we see these players every week, and in reality, maybe they're not worth millions more than the other talented young players at other clubs who their fans and journalists watch every week. But when you look at what the going rate in the market at the moment, and you look at Jack Clarke's output last year, you couple in with the fact that there are not many young English wingers playing in the EFL at the moment, certainly not off the left. I just think, you're joking. It's just absolutely nowhere.
Our friend Michael makes the point there is, I think, yes, we are biased in a sense that we see Jack Clarke and we see his talent and his importance to Sunderland, so we're obviously going to want more money. But a good barometer is, as you say, the current transfer market as a whole, and we see how much these players are going to Premier League clubs, to the Championship, and there's 2 or 3 examples I could name off the top of my head this window alone, and over the past couple of windows as well. And you think, obviously the story is that Burnley have come back with a third bid, which is likely being rejected. I think the figure was, I want to say 9 million or something. Did it go up slightly? 9 to 11 million. Let's just say, for argument's sake. And you just think, for the profile is, I mean, that's less actually than what he went to Tottenham for from Leeds initially, and he's a better player now. there's no doubt about
it. With 3 years left on his contract, I genuinely think that's quite derisory, and it makes you quite intrigued as to what's going on. If that's sort of the third bid, suggests there's a level of encouragement from somewhere. But but you wonder where that is, because it can't. Surely it can't be from Sunderland, because I think that's well below what I would value, and that's even, like I say, what we're discussing, that you accept you've got a little bit of a bias in these cases because you have a little bit of attachment to these players that you watch every week. But I mean, how much did Morgan Gibbs-White go to Nottingham Forest for from Wolves last year?
35, something like that.
No, I'm not saying Clarke should be in that bracket, but if we're saying a quarter of the price of that, for a young English player who I would guess his output in the Championship in terms of goals and assists was probably at a similar level to Morgan Gibbs-White, although I'm prepared to be corrected on that, but I suspect it's close to the mark. Double it, and I might start to get a little bit nervous and wonder what Sunderland will do. But until that point, for me, absolutely no chance.
So Morgan Gibbs-White in the Championship when he was at Sheffield United on loan, he got 11 goals in 35. I'm not sure on the assists, but yeah, Clarke's got similar levels of goals. Let me just quickly check that. Obviously, Clarke's figures that we've been talking about were in all competitions. Yeah, so he got 9 goals in the Championship. So Morgan Gibbs-White's got 2 more goals to game ratio. Morgan Gibbs-White played a bit less. Clarke pretty much played every game, but yeah, I think it's still a valid comparison in the sense that, similar age, English, going from the Championship to the Premier League, potentially, you would expect a bit more. Maybe Burnley are playing the long game. I don't know. They're entitled to bid how they want, I suppose, and you wouldn't expect them to come straight in with the figure they're going to end on. I suppose this is the game, sort of, isn't it?
Yeah. But it's interesting to me that they're supposedly close to signing James Trafford, who's obviously Manchester City goalkeeper, who's been on loan at Bolton for the last 2 years and has done exceptionally well. He's England under-21 starting goalkeeper. I think the fee is supposedly 15, rising to 17. And I think, young English goalkeeper, there aren't many of them. He's come up through Man City, so he's going to be perfect for Vincent Kompany's style. He'll have been playing that way all his life. Great potential. Yeah, fair enough. But I mean, surely Clarke's worth that as well. A player with, like I say, who provides the most important commodity in the game, goals and assists. Does so pretty regularly.
He's got them as well. A good balance of goals and assists.
And he's got 3 years left on his contract. I cannot fathom that he would go for less than approaching 20 million. I just and like I say, we're sort of maybe that's Sunderland's stance as well, and maybe at this stage it's not a great deal to worry about. Speakman's been pretty clear that they don't need to sell, and they're pretty comfortable with their valuations are, and that they're pretty relaxed. He sort of made the point in his interview with The Athletic, didn't he? That he didn't necessarily feel as if they were. He didn't use this phrase, but hopefully I'll convey what I think was getting across to people. They didn't feel like they were in the eye of the storm necessarily, under a huge amount of pressure with these players. So maybe that suggests that, Sunderland is seeing it the way we are at the moment, where they just don't, that these discussions just aren't at a level at the moment where it's potentially a big conundrum. Because as I say, as much as we are a little bit biased towards these players, actually in some cases the numbers really speak for themselves. And in Clarke's case, that's absolutely the case.
Right, so we're going to do a separate podcast maybe later in the week or next week, tackling developments at the Academy of Light with the under-21s, under-19s, and also the women's side of things as well. Obviously, we're approaching the pre-season games, Phil, and the pre-season tour of the US. There was another friendly against Mallorca at the Stadium of Light announced. Tony Mowbray did an interview with the club. Still some injury issues lingering, which is a little bit of a concern. He gave a pretty full and thorough update. Phil, what's the gist of it?
Yeah, I think it's probably not too far from what we expected. I think it was always probably a little bit of a pipe dream that everyone would just be able to get their boots on for the first day of the season.
Would be nice.
It's very mixed, isn't it? I think the big sort of setback, I think, over the summer, which we kind of knew about anyways, Adji Elise, right? I think obviously, he'd post on social media, didn't he, after the Luton game, that he'd had a recurrence and that he needed surgery. And so not a huge surprise that, certainly the indications from Mowbray are that he's not going to be fit to start the season. And that's a real disappointment, I think, because he's versatile. He's really confident on the ball. He's quick, he's athletic, all those things that we've seen. So that's a big setback. The much better news was Dennis Sirkin, who I was quite surprised and really pleased to see Mowbray say that he wasn't far away at all. Because I wondered whether Sirkin and Elise might be in a sort of similar time frame, and that would have left you pretty light on the left sort of side of defence for the start of the season. But if Sirkin's close, you've obviously also got Gooch, Huggins, and 09 who can all cover on that flank as well. So that's really positive. And it'll be nice to see Elliot Embleton back towards the end of pre-season. I think that's the one where I think we kind of hoped he might be sort of fully fit for the start of the season. Clearly, he's not going to be the case. But he could be in contention to be in the squad potentially against Ipswich if all goes well. So that's positive as well. And I think Stewart and Evans, we knew weren't going to be ready for the start of the season. Evans, I think, is behind Stewart. I think Evans will be a while yet. We might see Stewart at the end of pre-season, but probably only in little parts. And hopefully it won't be too long into the season until we see him as well. So it's definitely, I think it's broadly positive. But you're right, it's going to take a little way into the season before it starts to clear fully.
What are your thoughts on Elliot Embleton, Phil? And I'm not digging anybody out here because I think we all do this to a degree, but I've got a couple of friends and I'm in a few group chats and we're constantly discussing incomings and outgoings, and a lot of the chat I see, and I have arguments with friends about this all the time, is that, Elliot Embleton needs to go. He'll definitely be sold this summer. We've outgrown him, all of this sort of stuff. And it upsets me a bit, actually, because I really like Elliot Embleton. I think he's been very unlucky with injury. He's done a lot for the club. Obviously, the goal at Wembley. Similar but different to Batth in a way that I think that I would be surprised if he went this window. Obviously, getting back to fitness, see how he goes, play him a little bit. Maybe in January there's a conversation to be had. But for me personally, I don't necessarily understand this real... maybe desire is the wrong word, but it seems like a sort of eagerness to move Embleton on. I think he's a good player, and I think he could contribute for Sunderland, and I think we owe it to him as well to sort of nurse him back to fitness and then reassess the situation, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't get any impression whatsoever that's in any way an active consideration at Sunderland. Embleton's versatile. You can play him off the right, you can play him off the striker. In certain scenarios where you think you can have a lot of the ball, you can play deeper in midfield. And versatility is huge for a head coach, especially with somebody who's so comfortable on the ball. He's 2-footed. I think that, I've always felt that sometimes I think homegrown players can get quite a tricky ride at sometimes. I think the pressure is kind of magnified a little bit. And I think we've seen that. We've seen that with a lot of players, Lyndon Gooch, George Honeyman, even actually Jordan Henderson to a while when he first broke through. I think the highs and lows are probably bigger.
Dan Neil as well.
Yeah, the affection can be incredibly strong. And sometimes I think the criticism can be a little bit more stinging at times as well. And I think we've seen a lot of those homegrown players go through those phases. I mean, Lyndon Gooch is a very obvious one. I think for me, with Embleton, I think, broadly speaking, since the start of the season where we got promoted out of League One, I think his numbers have been more than good enough to warrant his place in the squad. His goals and assists output generally has been very good. He's also made big contributions at big times. And as I say, his versatility is a massive part of the conversation in terms of what he can bring from different positions. What I would say is that this season, there is an expectation that Sunderland are going to go up another gear, hopefully. And Embleton's in the same bracket as a lot of players where he'll be expected to develop with that. And there is going to be an expectation on it. Don't want to put expectation on him too early because he's got to get fit from a broken leg, which is no small thing.
Yeah.
But when he is fully fit, he will be expected to produce goals and assists, because he's going to be taking up these positions where Sunderland have really talented options, and there will be a pressure on him to produce. But I don't think should be seen as specific to Embleton in any way, shape or form. So I do think when he's fully fit, it's going to be a big season for him.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think even last year, when the start of the season, he wasn't necessarily a regular in the team. He's made big contributions. 2 assists away at Reading. You got the equaliser at Luton. So yeah, generally speaking, I think if Embleton's on the pitch for long enough, he tends to make a pretty significant contribution. And, we go back to these things, we were talking about earlier. Before you lose players like that, you've got to be pretty careful when you make that decision. I don't get the impression that's something to consider. And as you say, maybe it would be different later in the year. But for me, I think Tony Mowbray will be absolutely thrilled to potentially have Embleton back in his squad because of his versatility and his willingness to sort of take risks and try things. And obviously, the players who are like that can obviously be your own undoing as well sometimes. If you're willing to take those risks, if it doesn't come off, sometimes it can look not so good. And as a big England cricket fan, we're seeing that a little bit at the moment. What can be see your praise to the hilt one week, can bring you through some scrutiny another week. So I think it is a big season for Embleton, but I think that just reflects across the board. That there's going to be an expectation that I think there is an understanding now at Sunderland that you have to grow with the team and the club. Otherwise, there'll potentially be someone coming in. And I think there's loads of players in that category. All over the pitch. I don't see Embleton as any different to that.
It's interesting, actually, because he could almost be considered like a microcosm of the whole squad in a way, Elliot Embleton, because he's still only 24 years old, isn't it? So what you say about, which is incidentally about the average age of Sunderland's squad, first team squad would be 23, 24. So it will be interesting to see what happens. But yeah, Elliot Embleton, only 24. It feels like he's been around for about 10 years. And I suppose he has been around for about 5, 6 years when you consider he played a couple of times in that championship relegation season as well. Couple of injuries. Am I right in thinking that Jack Ross was really keen on having Embleton as a starter, but then he picked up an injury? Was it he started in the game against Oxford, first game of the season, wasn't it? The second game
he had a really bad hamstring injury.
That's right.
And then I think, if I remember rightly, he had a recurrence as well late that year under Phil Parkinson.
And then he was
dropped. We're going up.
Dropped from the Gidi as well, wasn't he?
We're going over ground, but Sunderland probably could have lost Embleton and regretted it. But the change to actually trusting young players and properly giving them an opportunity came just at the right time, probably to save Embleton's Sunderland career, thankfully. He's played a huge part in getting Sunderland to where they are now. Like if you actually sit and talk through it, I'm pretty sure we'd have done it at some point on this podcast. His run of big goals and assists on that run to League One promotion was pretty insane. So I'm excited to see him back. I enjoy watching him play. I like the way he takes risks. I like the way that you don't quite know what's coming from him. I think there's a lot more to come.
But, he loves a tackle as well, as we know.
He does love a tackle. Maybe a little bit too much, possibly. But I'm excited to see what's to come. But he is like a lot of players in the squad where he will have to find another gear this year. And I don't think there's any sort of anything untoward about that. I just think that's the price, if you like, of playing at an ambitious club that seems to be on upward curve. And so it'll be exciting to see how he fares.
Indeed. Well, that was a lovely cathartic chat. Phil, probably draws an end to the Raw podcast. We are across all of your social medias as usual. Of course, you can visit the Sunderland Echo website for all the latest transfer news. Phil's got an injury update as well with expected return dates, lots of analysis, all that good stuff. And catch us later on in the week or perhaps next week where we'll be bringing you another podcast. And thanks again for